Son Altesse Sérénissime, le prince héritier Alois von und zu Liechtenstein. Son Altesse royale, la princesse héritière Sophie von und zu Liechtenstein.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is now my honor to welcome among us in this chamber His Serene Highness Hereditary, Prince Alois of Liechtenstein, as well as Her Royal Highness Hereditary, Princess Sophie of Liechtenstein. Your Serene Highness, your presence today, as your country is so successfully chairing the Committee of Ministers for the third time since its accession to the Council of Europe in 1987, is a clear symbol of your deep attachment to our European fundamental values and principles, and a gesture for which I would like to sincerely thank you. Guided by the motto, united by our values towards a better future for the needs of all, the priorities chosen by the Presidency of Liechtenstein are clearly in line with the core values of the Council of Europe. Protecting and promoting human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, strengthening the European Court of Human Rights, and providing support for Ukraine, but also implementing the decisions that taken at the fourth summit of heads of states and governments of the Council of Europe. These are challenging goals on which you can rest assured that the Parliamentary Assembly stands together with your country. Your venue coincides with important anniversaries. 2024 marks the 75th anniversary of the Council of Europe and the first anniversary of the Reykjavik summit, where historic decisions were taken by our heads of states and governments. This is a time to draw lessons and a time to look forward to the future. Without further ado, I have the honor, Your Serene Highness, to give you the floor.
Dear President of the Parliamentary Assembly, thank you very much for your kind words of introduction. Dear Secretary General of the Parliamentary Assembly, dear Secretary General of the Council of Europe, dear members of the Parliamentary Assembly, Excellencies, it is my pleasure to address your assembly here today. Liechtenstein has long attached great importance to its membership in the Council of Europe. It is therefore not only a challenge, but also a privilege to hold this office of presidency in the Committee of Ministers in these turbulent times. The multilateral system faces multiple threats. The core values of the Council of Europe, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, are increasingly challenged. The present seems to be characterized by aggressive power politics, anti-democratic tendencies, growing nationalism, and disregard for the rule of law and the rules-based international order. Throughout history, we have repeatedly learned that these developments have the potential to lead to destruction and human suffering. The Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine sadly serves as yet another example for the culmination of these elements. Particularly in times like these, multilateral fora, such as the Council of Europe and the United Nations, prove all the more important. Once again, it has become apparent that our security can only be ensured by the unconditional respect for the rules-based international order. In these turbulent times, we are reminded that the inclusive and effective functioning of multilateral organizations, as the Council of Europe and the United Nations, plays a critical role to uphold peace and stability. Aggressive power politics must not prevail. Those challenging our common commitment to the rules-based order must be held accountable. With the establishment of the Register of Damages, the Council of Europe has taken an important first step towards ensuring accountability for the Russian aggression against Ukraine. On the way forward, it remains of critical importance that the crime of aggression is investigated and prosecuted, and that all those responsible are held accountable. There will be no peace without justice. Initiatives like these underline the importance of multilateral cooperation once again. It is thus critical to strengthen these platforms and to equip them with the necessary means to ensure effective continuation of their work for the years to come. Multilateral fora need to be fit for the future and, more importantly, be able to adapt to changing circumstances in order to overcome future challenges. Nevertheless, we are witnessing a trend to the opposite direction. With the return of rising nationalism, global decision-making processes seem increasingly to migrate from inclusive multilateral fora to alternative forms dominated only or predominantly by large powers. The inclusive nature of multilateral organizations is lost, and the perspectives of small states are underrepresented. Small states make up the majority of the international community. The effective global implementation of rules, therefore, depends just as much on their feasibility in small states as on the will of the more influential powers to take the initiative. Without the involvement of small states in decision-making processes, however, this may prove difficult. Multilateral cooperation through organizations such as the Council of Europe or the United Nations therefore offer a critical opportunity for inclusive processes. Multilateral organizations' greatest assets are their member states. Each of them offers a unique set of best practices that may also assist reform processes within international organizations to ensure their future-oriented functioning. The Council of Europe can also benefit from such processes. For example, it is not only crucial for the success of companies, but also for states and international organizations that they constantly develop further. In particular, it helps to scrutinize their core competences and tasks, and to review where the focus should lie in the future and where the increasingly limited resources are best deployed. Small states specifically bring important perspectives to the table, as their ability to exert international influence outside multilateral fora is rather limited. They have to develop focus, flexibility, and adaptability. The Liechtenstein economy is a good example for this. As a consequence of our very small domestic market, we are disproportionately affected by nationalist and protectionist policies of our main trading partners. At the same time, however, these challenges offer unique opportunities. They force our companies to boost innovation. With this approach, a number of Liechtenstein companies have become global market leaders in their areas of expertise. Geographical size is also not indicative of the impact the state can have, particularly in multilateral fora. Liechtenstein has proven this time and again, be it in the Council of Europe, the UN, or the European Economic Area. Through prioritization in specific areas of expertise, Liechtenstein has been able to set relevant standards in the past. In 2022, for example, Liechtenstein championed the so-called veto initiative. Following this resolution, the UN General Assembly must automatically meet within 10 days if the veto is used in the Security Council by one of its 5 permanent members. This resolution establishing the veto initiative was ultimately adopted by consensus. By enhancing the role of the General Assembly, the veto initiative took an important step forward to strengthening inclusive multilateralism and the international rule of law. Due to the size of our country, we are all the more dependent on the functioning of a rules-based international order and on good foreign policy relations. This applies both to the relations with our neighbors and to the relation with our other international partners. For the maintenance of excellent relations with our other international partners, Liechtenstein participation in multilateral organizations is of vital importance. Liechtenstein's accession to the Council of Europe in 1978 has not only helped to further secure our sovereignty and to extend our international recognition as an independent state. With our membership, we received a seat at the table in this European community of values. This also offered us the opportunity to actively contribute both to the development of new European standards and to the protection of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in all of Europe. A responsibility we take very serious. At the same time, it allowed us to grow and progress with our own common standards. Our presidency in the Committee of Ministers further provides us with the opportunity to strengthen the values of this organization and to promote the future-oriented functioning of the Council of Europe. In these turbulent times, the Committee of Ministers is coincidentally led by a series of presidencies of small member states. Perhaps this is exactly what is needed. I thank you.
Your Highness, on behalf of the Assembly, I want to thank you most warmly for your address and for your country's so successfully presidency of the Committee of Ministers. Thank you once again. Dear colleagues, we now come to the joint debate on two reports from the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development. The first is titled Mainstreaming the Human Rights to Safe, Clean, Healthy and Sustainable Environment with the Reykjavik Process, document 15955, presented by Mr. Simon Mutquin. And the second is titled Towards Council of Europe Strategies for Healthy Seas and Oceans to Counter the Climate Crisis, document 15956, presented by Mrs. Yulia Ovchinnikova. We will aim to finish this item by about 12:30 p.m. So I now call Mr. Simon Mutquin, rapporteur, to present the first report. Mr. Mutquin, you have 7 minutes now and 3 minutes at the end to reply to the debate. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur. Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, dear members, the first thing I would say is that this report has been presented 3 years after another important report which put forward a whole series of measures viewing to implement those measures advocated in Reykjavik. You might remember 3 years ago we voted unanimously for a report calling for the right to a healthy environment in a whole series of Council of Europe instruments. An additional protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights was adopted, a convention to our organisation's social charter, and we also had the either-or freestanding convention. I say that because we had the choice back then as to whether we attached it to an existing convention or a new convention. Since then, a lot has happened. First of all, the pandemic, which obviously affected all of us, followed by something which is more than a crisis, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, against Europe, which triggered off, amongst other things, an energy crisis. Unfortunately, this meant that our Assembly lost its interest in climate matters. As you remember, young people demonstrating for the climate created a real movement. It was also promoted by the Georgian presidency, as well as many members of this chamber. So, despite that lull, the environmental crisis is still the major crisis facing humanity, bringing many other crises with it. It triggers off not only human suffering, but also migratory movements. And that's why I believe that the climate crisis is the most important crisis facing us. So, as you know, the climate crisis has always been a real threat to us, even well before it figured high on the political agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd remind you that the last 3 months have been the hottest months ever measured. The climate crisis also involves rising temperatures in the ocean. My colleagues will talk about this afterwards. And the rise in temperature in the ocean outstrips those in the air. 260 million people are expected to have to migrate because of the crisis between now and 2050. And 12.5 million young women will no longer have access to education because of the climate crisis. So, once again, this demonstrates just how topical the climate crisis is. It's not something which threatens tomorrow, it's today. The climate crisis is affecting young people, vulnerable people, farmers, So why have we moved to adopt this report now? First of all, there's been an emerging consensus in recent years. The United Nations, for example, a few weeks after our report was adopted 3 years ago, the United Nations publicly recognized the right to a healthy environment, and all member states of the Council of Europe voted for that recognition at the UN. And then we had the fourth Reykjavik summit, which for the first time meant that member states here were able to sign up to this right to a healthy environment, and it also initiated the Reykjavik process and the right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment, and this proposal is currently being examined by the Committee of Ministers. Another important event took place a few days ago. The European Court of Human Rights condemned for the first time a member state for its failure to act to tackle climate change. And I would like to welcome or salute the group of elders from Switzerland who put forward this case, which I think is so important for humanity. I'd like to briefly quote from that ruling. The court says there's a legal and scientific consensus on the existence of climate change and its negative impact on people and environments, as well as the severity of this phenomenon, including the serious risk that climate change will go beyond the point at which it's irreversible. So I'd like to share a few ideas with you about the Reykjavik process to achieve a right to a healthy environment, and then set up the outline of a responsible legislative process. So we know that the people politically recognize the importance of this now, but what we have to do is to identify a clear legal framework to defend this right. In other words, it's not just a theoretical right, it has to be a self-standing right. So the problem, for the time being, many people say that we don't have a shared understanding or definition of what the right to a healthy environment is. This is not true because 85% of members of the United Nations and, of course, members of the Council of Europe recognize the right to a healthy environment. But the difficulty arises when it comes to finding a definition within our instruments, but this is very important if we are to move towards a common definition of the right to a healthy environment. And the Council of Europe is the best place to do this. So in terms of regulation, we have to go further and faster. So over the last 3 years, the Council has been looking at the types of instruments which will most be suitable for the right to a healthy environment. So I talked about the additional protocol to the Charter, the additional protocol to the Convention, and the other option was a new freestanding convention. Our Assembly must continue to promote an approach based on human rights, calling for recognition of another recognition, which is the right, a single right to a healthy environment, which is superior to all individual rights. And this is essential both for today's generations and for future generations. We won't be starting from a clean sheet. Our organization has already concluded numerous conventions which touch on the right to a healthy environment. So, for example, the Berne Convention. So we have to build on those existing instruments. So how can we organize the Reykjavik process? What can we do in practical terms to achieve its objective? This means we have to start perhaps by redefining the objectives in a more realistic way. So the first thing we have to do is to have the bar has to be set high when it comes to ethics, responsibility, accessibility, transparency. How can we manage all of this? We propose that an intergovernmental committee be established. That's essential now for coordination so as to enable us to move forward in a practical way towards recognition of the right. We also need expertise in the environmental field, as well as recognition of the need to have environmental defenders. I think that we also need a complaints procedure, an appeals procedure on environmentally related matters. And we're also in favour of the creation of a post of special representative within the General Secretariat who'd be responsible for examining these complaints and improving visibility of the organisation. So just to wind up this brief introduction, I would like to reiterate the importance of including young people in this whole process of reflection, young people and vulnerable people. A few weeks ago, the Social Affairs Committee went to Banjul. We met some fantastic young people who very often knew a lot more about the environment than we do. They've got important things to say, important things to contribute. And the environmental transition will be impossible without support and involvement of young people and vulnerable people. And these are the two groups who are most affected by climate collapse. Thank you very much.
I now call Mrs. Yulia Ovchinnikova, rapporteur, to present the second report. You have 7 minutes now and 3 minutes at the end to reply to the debate. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, dear Mr. Chairman. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the Council of Europe was the first international organization that recognized the right to a safe and healthy environment as an integral part of human rights, both by its decision, by its resolution and debates. Altogether, we are pushing forward both in the legal and social aspects, raising awareness and matching the scientific justification with political solutions. Following the Reykjavik process, a summit of the heads of states and government of the Council of Europe, political recognition, the right to clean, healthy and sustainable environmental paves the way to the better protection and the full exercises of human rights of current and future generation. So it's well known that seas and ocean serve as vital components of Earth's ecosystem, contributing significantly to the sustenance of life and planet. And oceans are seen to regulate the chemistry and global climate on the planet. They play an essential role for life, for economy, for transportation, but nevertheless, they are under threat. It's timely to consider our heritage, its condition, its role, its future. Acknowledging the role of the healthy seas and ocean in mitigating crises, the Reykjavik process and this resolution emphasizes the responsibility of the Council of Europe, member states, in realizing Sustainable Development Goal 14. This goal aims at conserving and sustainable using the ocean, sea and marine resources to address a host of direct and indirect threats, including plastic and other marine pollution, ocean warming, eutrophication, acidification, and collapse of fisheries and biodiversity. So we are fortunate as well, because inside of our organization, nature-based tools such as Berne Convention, Landscape Convention, and others, to tell the truth, they are really unique. We must combat the collapse of biodiversity. This instrument provides the necessary framework to protect effectively and efficiently at least 30% of our seas and oceans. We must repair our maritime domain too. Dear ladies and gentlemen, today I'm speaking not only as parliamentarian, but also as environmental researcher as well. This resolution is grounded on the latest scientific facts and findings, numerous expert discussion and wide consultation with the key stakeholders in this area, of course, including the International Maritime Organization. And I'm confident that recommendation translated into action by both the member states and the Council of Europe can make a difference, as well as lead to significant changes. First, this can be the role of the national parliaments and the Council of Europe to underscore the importance of international treaties and conventions in protecting marine life and biodiversity, as well as to push forward their ratification and implementation. For example, the United Nations High Seas Treaty, adopted in 2023, recognized the high seas as a global public good. Moreover, I believe that the Reykjavik process will strengthen the link between the environmental and human rights, as well as enhance the tool available to the Council of Europe for environmental protection, including necessary resources. Secondly, member and non-member states are urged to enhance their national legislation on protected and restoring marine areas, as well as to support major international treaties in the strengthening environmental rights. Measures to combat overfishing, illegal fishing, and plastic pollution are highlighted, along with the promotion of ecocide legislation and legal recognition of ecocide. And third, to ensure a good governance in marine resources, the resolution recommends the creation of network marine protected areas and improved data sharing and reporting mechanism. Additionally, it suggests strengthened cooperation with the International Maritime Organization, the UN and expert organization, of course, with researchers. So the International Maritime Organization is the main organization providing a framework for oceans and seas, where the Council of Europe has held an observer status since 1974. And I welcome the opportunities that pull into efforts to organization would bring. And the resolution encouraged member states to consider environmental compact, an initiative for addressing environmental damage affects the Black Sea and Azov Sea due to the Russian war aggression against Ukraine. We have discussed in our assembly the environmental consequences of the war, its terrible regional and global impact, but more action is needed. And after all, dear colleague, I enjoyed work on this report during 2 years, and I've had an opportunity to work with amazing professionals, married researchers, experts, high-level international organizations, and like me, thanks involved. First of all, the Secretariat of Committee Social Efforts and Health and Sustainable Development we started our report with Guillaume Parent, and we continued and finished the report with Aiste Romanovskaite. Thank you very much. Professor Bayram Öztürk from the Istanbul University, Professor Pavlo Goldin from Institute of Zoology, and my expert team, Irina Degtyaryova, Viktor Tsipeyev, Irina Radkivska. So let's join forces and take action together. Let's look up to the treat oceans and seas with respect, considering them as fragile and delicate entities they are. I call you to support the draft resolution. Thank you very much, and thank you, rapporteur, as well. We go together every time. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. We now go to the speakers on behalf of political groups, and I first give the floor to Lord Keane on behalf of the European Conservatives. Lord Keane, you have the floor.
Thank you, President and colleagues. I wish to distinguish two separate and distinct issues. First, the nature of the risk and challenges presented by anthropogenic climate change. Second, the competence of the Council of Europe under the Convention with respect to the contracting parties. I shall begin with the first. The Reykjavik Declaration referred to the triple planetary crisis of pollution, climate change, and loss of biodiversity. The European Environment Agency Climate Risk Assessment, published on 11th March of this year, highlighted two critical findings. First, that human-induced climate change is affecting the planet, and second, that Europe is the fastest warming continent in the world. At this time, I do not require to dispute those findings, which highlight a number of challenges. First, the need for action. Second, and more importantly, the complexity of the challenges climate change poses in legal, political, practical, and logistical terms. And that brings me to the second distinct issue. What competence, if any, does the Council of Europe have in terms of the Convention to direct contracting parties as to how they must address these challenges? There is a very compelling argument that the Council of Europe has no such competence under the Convention. Over the past 20 years, our Court of Human Rights has repeatedly stressed that there is no article of the Convention designed to provide general protection of the environment. In Ugala and Georgia in 2017, the Court reiterated that there is no explicit right in the Convention to a clean and quiet environment. In the case of Cretatus in Greece, the Court pointed out that the Convention is not specifically designed to provide general protection of the environment. Of course, in response to the foregoing, this Parliamentary Assembly has repeatedly recommended that the Convention should encompass a competence in relation to the environment. Thus, Recommendation 1431 of 1999 on environmental protection, and Recommendation 1885 of 2009 on the right to a healthy environment. But, and this matters, none of the recommendations from this Parliamentary Assembly to provide a protocol to the Convention giving competence in relation to the environment has been accepted and approved by the contracting parties to the Convention. Consequently, that urgent issue remains one for other international instruments and domestic legislation, and is not one for the Convention, and consequently not one for the Council of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Keane. I now give the floor to Madame Tanguy on behalf of ALDE Group. You have 3 minutes.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. Colleagues, the record temperatures recorded throughout the world in 2023 remind us how urgent it is to make additional efforts to protect the planet from the irreversible ramifications of global warming. The ramifications of climate change on oceans and seas are also a huge cause for concern. Rising sea temperatures are having a cascading effect on marine biodiversity and human societies and are threatening the survival of our maritime heritage. This joint debate is an opportunity to address the issue of the right to a healthy, safe and sustainable environment based on 2 very rich reports accompanied by a set of particularly interesting recommendations which call on the Council of Europe to draft a global strategy for environmental governance as part of the Reykjavik process launched at the end of the organization's 4th summit held in May of last year. Our group for many years now has been working alongside the Assembly to secure the recognition of the right to a healthy environment within the Council of Europe. In September 2021, under the presidency of Rick Adams, a key debate was held, the aim of which was to consolidate this right in legislation, policies, practices and public consciousness. Our group broadly supported the adoption of Recommendation 2020-11 from 2021, which called for the introduction of additional protocols to the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Social Charter on a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. In 2022, following this debate, a network of members of Parliament for a healthy environment, of which I'm a member, was created. The ALDE Group shares the conclusions of the 2 rapporteurs and will lend its support to it. It welcomes the initiative of the Reykjavik process, which underlines a significant awareness among the heads of state and government with a view to taking coordinated measures to counter the impact of this triple global crisis linked to pollution, climate change and the loss of biodiversity. The parliamentarian Julia Ochnikova reminds us that the seas and oceans must not be excluded from this strategic reflection by the Council of Europe. As a Member of Parliament for a coastal constituency in Brittany, I see every day the impact that global warming has on marine biodiversity and its heritage. With this in mind, we need to welcome the signing of the Treaty on the High Seas in 2023, as it will not only help to fill the legal vacuum, but it will also guarantee better protection of biodiversity in international waters. Let's not forget that the oceans and seas are both the lungs and the largest carbon sink on the planet. It is therefore essential, as our colleague recommends, that the Council of Europe supports the implementation of international treaties promoting the protection of the seas and oceans and strengthens its involvement in the activities of the International Maritime Organization. I'd also like to thank my Ukrainian colleague for mentioning the Berne Convention in her work. I was in fact behind a motion for resolution designed to strengthen the financial and institutional stability of this convention, which, may I remind you, is the very first international treaty devoted to the protection of wild fauna and flora in Europe and beyond. We should also We should also welcome the creation of an intersecretariat working or task force which will be responsible for drawing up the cross-sectoral action plan on which the Council of Europe's future global strategy on the environment should be based, and encourage a member state to support the establishment of an ad hoc intergovernmental committee on the environment and human rights, the Reykjavik Committee. And I hope that we can have bold instruments to fight effectively and sustainably against the consequences of climate change on human rights.
Now I give the floor to Madame Stambach, Terre Noire. You have 3 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, on behalf of my group, I'd like to thank the rapporteurs for the work, which is very much in the general interest. The house is burning. According to scientists, 75% of the surface of the globe has been affected by human activities, 1 million species affected by extinction, and 80% of wetlands and highly sensitive ecosystems are threatened with this disappearance. We are threatening the 6th mass extinction, thousands of times more powerful than the last, and 6 planetary systems out of 10 have been affected. The effects of climate change have become increasingly violent, and those most severely affected are the most fragile members of society. This means that the right to a healthier environment is fundamentally necessary. This is a right which is now being recognised by the United Nations in the historic Declaration of 2021. the Council of Europe can no longer be the only regional human rights system not to have recognised this right. Moreover, last week, the European Court of Human Rights adopted a historical judgment condemning Switzerland for its climate inaction. The right to a healthy environment should be a clear link between human rights and the preservation and reconstitution of the environment. I agree with the rapporteur, Mr. Mukkan. The Reykjavik Declaration said we're going through a crisis. This is not purely the case. This is the result of structural shortcomings in the past. It's also the result of the highly destructive logic behind the capitalist system. This leads to long-term damage to the earth and its inhabitants based on the need to make money. It's not a chance occurrence that we're talking about Mr. Oshinkova's report this morning, talking about preservation or linking preservation of our seas to the right to a healthy environment. 50% of the oxygen that we breathe comes from phytoplankton. This is why it's important to defend oceans. Moreover, maritime reserves could be a crucial lever to tackle climate change. But how can we talk about protecting maritime reserves if industrial fishing is allowed? That's an enormous threat. In recent years, more than 70% of maritime reserves in Europe have been fished. And the 18 European fishing vessels, which are more than 80 meters long, exclusively fish in these reserves. In France, we're very much attached to this. The most important maritime reserve in Europe is in the Bay of Biscay. The right to a healthy environment should enable us to have a clear definition of the protected areas, excluding any extractive activities, including industrial fisheries, according to the recommendation of the International Organization for Conservation of Nature. So after the two poles, Europe is the continent which is heating most quickly. Recent studies in Nature show that the impact of this is twice as bad as we thought. The Reykjavik process must enable us to adopt a binding right to a healthy environment as an additional protocol as quickly as possible, so as to ensure that we can deal with the complaints stemming from this. Moreover, an international group of NGOs has been calling for this right. We would call on the Committee of Ministers and the future Secretary General of the Council of Europe to live up to this challenge. As Antoine Saint-Exupéry said, we're not inheriting our parents' earth. We are simply borrowing it from our children. Thank you.
Stambach Terre-Noire, who spoke on behalf of the EU-EL group. And now I give the floor to Mrs. Bayer on behalf of the Socialist group. Please, Mrs. Bayer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Who ignores the evidence of climate catastrophe and that it is made by men, by us, that ignores the responsibility to act, to safeguard our future and the future of next generations. And we have to take influence, we have to take measures. And one of the ways, I think that's the best one, is the way to a human right, to a safe and healthy and sustainable environment. And everything else will mean an end of civilization as we know it, probably an end of humanity and of humankind. And the way forward is with a law, with a robust law that also includes the oceans, because oceans are really key for that. And since September last year, the BBNG, the Treaty on Maritime Diversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, is open for signatures, and we all hope that it will be effective in 2025. We have to be prepared for that, to really have a quick ratification, and it will bring very important steps for a safe ocean. For instance, that really the maritime source of protein is there, that we have sustainable fishery and a large extension of marine protected areas, but also that we maintain the oceans, a healthy ocean, both as a CO2 sink, but also as a producer of oxygen. Every second breath we take comes from the oxygen, statistically. But what is not tackled neither in the BBNG nor in the report on the oceans, which I very welcome, is the question of deep seabed mining. And let me throw your attention on that topic as well. It's a very pressing issue. We know more about the surface of the moon as we know on the deep seabed, and in the run of resources and accepting that they are finite on this earth, enterprises are looking for new regions for mining resources, and there is the idea that big harvest machines go over the seabed, the deep seabed, and harvest resources, harvest deep sea nodules, and destroy everything else what comes into their way, which we do not know what exactly will come into their way, but we can estimate that it's very important for the balance, the biological balance, not only in the seas, but also for the whole earth, also for us as human beings. So there is a parliamentary initiative on a call of a moratorium for deep seabed mining, and as long as we do not know about the consequences and how we can handle that, and I would like to call to all on you to hold your governments responsible, accountable for that. The next meeting, the next session
Please
of the Deep Seabed Authority is in July. Please be there, please raise your voice. Even landlocked countries have a voice, and we have to save our planet.
Thank you, Mrs. Bayer. I now give the floor to Mrs. Eder Gitzstaller on behalf of EPP CD Group. Please, the floor is yours.
Vielen Dank, Frau.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. Colleagues, I'd like first of all to thank the rapporteurs for the reports. I think certainly in current times as the ones we're going through at the moment, it's a very good idea to place emphasis on the climate because we're all affected by climate change. If anyone is denying this, well, I think they're living on a different planet. We've had problems in Austria caused by snow in winter in our ski resorts, and we all know that this is all down to do with climate change. And we've heard that there are going to be 72 million people between now and 2050 who will be driven to migrate as a result of climate change. We need to deal with this issue. We need to look at the health of seas and oceans as well. What I'm very pleased about was the Swiss climate defenders and the key role that they've played, because, of course, it's been pointed out how much we're dealing with human rights as well in this context, and the rapporteur, of course, pointed out the vulnerability of people, and in particular people in the elderly people are very much affected by this, and I really would like to say that I'm very grateful to the Swiss elderly people who lodged an application with the European Court of Human Rights with regard to seas and oceans. Well, the health of these seas and oceans is ever so important, regardless of whether you live. I live in a landlocked country, that is Austria, but we are affected by this. We have the Danube River, and it flows into the sea. And of course, we are affected by environmental pollution from this, and we need to ensure that it remains a clean, healthy river. 70% of oxygen is produced from the world, and more than 90% of warming and 25% of carbon dioxide comes from the seas, and therefore it's so important for us to factor this point in with regard to the seas and oceans. And one very important point is the UN High Seas Treaty that needs to be brought to a successful conclusion, and we need to continue to discuss this as well here so that measures can be taken with this in mind. Within the EPP political group, we can simply support this because it's all about our future, our survival, our children, our grandchildren, and their children. So my appeal to all of you is let's start acting together and looking at this strategy for the future, and let's think about it every day. What can we do? We are parliamentarians, of course, and what role can we play? What influence can we have to ensure that the right conditioning factors are set? And it's all about this, about taking action now. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mrs. Eder Gitzstaller. Now I give the floor to Mrs. Floridia. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. President, I'll speak in Italian. Ringrazio I colleghi relatori per...
I would like to start by thanking our colleagues, the rapporteurs, for this excellent report, which underlines the urgent need, both inside and outside the Council of Europe, to adopt a robust environmental strategy which will enable us to step up the fight against the devastating effects of this triple global crisis caused by pollution, climate change, and loss of biodiversity. This is the overriding objective which should underpin all our work in our parliaments, either at the national level or here in the Council of Europe. This is, of course, the ideal place to guarantee respect of human rights, a pluralist democracy, and the rule of law. Moreover, our organisation is now expected to respond to problems caused by the climate crisis in line with the request for protection coming from a whole group of citizens who've suffered for too long. We have an important role to play here in the institution, a political role, and this is something which has to involve stepping up a debate on the impact of climate change on human rights. We still have an embryonic right to a clean environment here in the Council of Europe, and it's now more urgent than ever to try step our efforts to improve this. We need to strengthen the legal framework linked to the right of each and every one of us to live in a healthy environment. This is fundamentally important to guarantee for future and present generations a sustainable existence. In particular, the Reykjavik process calls for adopting an additional protocol to the Convention with an intergovernmental committee. I would like to wind up my brief presentation by reminding you of the historic decision handed down by the European Court of Human Rights back on the 9th of April in a case proposed by a group of elderly people from Switzerland who've accused their country of violating the obligations stemming from the Convention when it comes to protecting its citizens against climate change. This is an historic decision. For the first time, the court has recognized as being part of the scope of the Convention the right of each and every one of us to effective protection from our states against the serious negative effects of climate change on our health, our well-being, and our quality of life. This is an immensely important turning point, which we very much welcome. This is a first of many, we hope, courageous steps forward, taking us towards the right to a healthy environment so that to ensure that each and every one of us can survive in the world. This is essential that we, as citizens, are able to live out the dreams we have for our lives on the earth, both today, in today's world, and, of course, in tomorrow's society. Thank you. Thank you, Aurora.
I call next Mr. Klein-Wachter. The floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Madam President, should the right to a healthy environment be recognized in law as an autonomous human right? I'm firmly convinced it should not be. The reasoning behind it is already very flawed. The first paragraph of the report says that climate change is the greatest existential emergency for humankind and that this emergency is mainly due to the lack of long-lasting structural action. Wait a minute. The state of emergency is normally marked by the fact that governments lift or waive human rights, not that they create new human rights. And human rights are usually defensive rights of a citizen against an overacting sovereign. So how can human rights be directed against inaction? Unlike torture or imprisonment, climate change is not a sovereign action. The government does not order heat or flooding to happen. So the very concept of human rights is actually not applicable to this issue. A lot of people have referenced the court decision of the European Court of Human Rights in the case of the climate seniors against Switzerland. And that is actually a low point in this organization. The court has ruled that the Swiss have to introduce basically a CO2 budget or CO2 reforms, even though the Swiss in a referendum in 2021 had decided they do not want that. They had a referendum on the issue. They voted no. And now they have to introduce it nevertheless. That ruling is directed against democracy. We are here to protect democracy, and we cannot allow judges to overrule democratic decisions. Where is the division of power here? Where is the role of the legislative power here? We're responsible as representatives to actually make politics and make policy the way we think is right, and then the judges can control us. The major problem of a right to a healthy environment is that it actually enters into conflict with other human rights. What is the relation of this new human right that you're suggesting to, for instance, the right to property, to the right to private life, to the right to life even? Does that mean that for the environment, I can be legally disowned? Does it mean that for the sake of a healthy environment or a fight against climate change, I can be evicted from my home, for instance, because it's gas-powered? Does it mean that if I'm sick, I'm in a coma, I'm only emitting CO2 emissions and not contributing to society, I can be killed? What, dear colleagues, is the relation of this new human right to other human rights? You will have to answer this question before suggesting to introduce that as a human right. You may regulate action on climate change, but you should never, ever open the door for environmental human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, colleague. I now give the floor to Mr. Hassler. 3 minutes.
Ja, danke.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. Colleagues, first of all, I'd like to thank both rapporteurs for producing this very important report and the key work carried out. The so-called triple planetary crisis, environmental pollution, climate change, and loss of biodiversity, is without doubt one of the most serious contemporary problems on our planet today, and we have to face this. This crisis emphasizes, like few others before, that crises do not stop at national borders. We therefore need to call for coordinated multilateral cooperation, as this being the only way to face this crisis. Liechtenstein is one of the countries that has so far recognized the right to a safe, clean and healthy environment. It's done this politically, but not yet through legislation. However, we are closely following the discussions that are being held on formally recognizing the right, as well as the challenges in terms of definition and unresolved issues. Reports such as the ones we're dealing with today help us considerably. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Hassler. I now give the floor to Mrs. Clyde. Please, the floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Thank you, President. I want to thank both reporters for their really great reports and recommendations, because with your work you deepen how we think about human rights and how we think beyond human rights. You try to fortify the situation. I speak from a country that has a right already for a clean and livable environment, and I can tell the worried colleagues that we are having a thriving economy and attracting really competitive companies due to a good livable situation. We talk about human rights. Let me tell a little bit about the human rights of the children in my area where I live. When I came to live there, my son had asthma. The clean air situation was really bad. A lot of children had the same problem. They were not able to go to school because they were sick. Every winter they had ammonia and they had to stay home. The families had to make high costs to pay for the medicine, and they also lost working days because they have to take care of their children. So if you live in an unclean, unhealthy situation, your human rights are fundamentally targeted. So I'm very happy that we speak about a binding right, because what happened in my city when a judge said it was not good enough is that they started to take measures, and nobody was expropriated. We built a really good, clean, healthy city. So now children can go to school, the parents can go to work, and we don't need to make unnecessary costs. This right makes a more equal and more livable society possible. And that is so very important, because we all can escape this situation. But people with a low income, they are very often forced to live in the areas where they are already living. And that makes them vulnerable for unclean health situation and every thing that comes from that. It is also important for the future generations because we have very limited times to achieve what we have binded ourselves by when we all signed the Paris Agreement, including Switzerland. And by signing the Paris Agreement, we said we would do all we can do to prevent critical climate change. And the court has not said you need to take which measures you need to take. The court said do take all necessary measures. So this right is of the greatest importance, and I fully support the work of my colleagues, and I hope we will give a positive sign from the Council of Europe on this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Clyde. In the debate, I call next Monsieur Cadec. Please, the floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by thanking the members, the rapporteurs, for this very important key report, which comes at a key moment, just a few days after the key decision from the European Court of Human Rights regarding 3 cases on climate change. As far as the Swiss case is concerned, the court ruled that Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights includes a right to individuals for effective protection from states against the negative and damaging effects of climate change on their lives, their health, their well-being and their quality of life. This is a major decision. The impact of this will have to be carefully analysed when it comes to states' policy making. I would like to focus on the key role played by oceans when it comes to the fight against climate change. The oceans are both the lungs of the Earth, but also an enormous carbon sink. Research suggests that seas and oceans produce 50% of the oxygen we need. They absorb 25% of CO2 emissions and capture 90% of the heat generated. Global warming, global heating, threatens the role played by oceans and seas. It threatens marine biodiversity and resources. The US Atmospheric Agency confirmed a few weeks ago that a new coral bleaching event has been underway since February 2023. This is the second time in less than 10 years. This underlines how urgent it is that we act to defend seas and oceans. And this should be linked in with the broader-based right to a healthy and sustainable environment. This challenge is particularly relevant to France. France has the world's second largest area of sea, 20% of the world's coral reefs and 10% of its atolls. More than 10% of worldwide marine diversity is present in French overseas territories. So I'd like to support the call for the creation of more marine resources and protection of the resources in those zones. And I would also like to pick up on the position of the European Parliament Fisheries Committee, where a reference has been made to the essential role played in environmental policy in protecting fish stocks. I would also like to share with my own experience as an elected official from Brittany, where an offshore wind farm has just been developed. Projects of this type must absolutely recognise the specific nature of the marine and other environment they're in. They should be preceded by an impact study and should not go ahead until full consultation has been guaranteed with all users of the sea, in particular fishers. So going beyond general principles to practical action in the field, that requires a great deal of tact and know-how as well as political determination if we want to manage to adopt these projects in a serene local environment. Thank you. Thank you, Anna.
Give the floor to Mrs. Mezentseva for 3 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame Présidente. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Social Committee, the Chairman, and of course our dear colleague Yulia Ovchinnikova. If not all the members know, her background is in science, in chemistry, biology, and she was that lady who during the first days of Russian occupation of the city of Donetsk managed to to move the university, the national university, to the safe location of central Ukraine. And Yulia, I know how much of an effort it took you to do this report, and I want also to take some minutes of your attention, dear colleagues, because in the very title of it, we have a very important document, which is Reykjavik Declaration. And this is thanks to you, dear colleagues. We've managed to put the point of sustainable environment, safe environment, and the basic human right for the safe environment in the Reykjavik Declaration last May in Iceland. It is due to you that we actually had the Reykjavik, the conference in Reykjavik, only the fourth time in 75 years of the existence of this organization. I also would like to pay attention that the current international armed conflicts, like the one we have of Russia against Ukraine, bring the new notions into international justice and international dimensions, such as ecocide, and how can we manage to measure it with compensation mechanism or other means of help for the people is still under the question. I also want to pay attention, dear colleagues, to the great amendments that passed in this resolution to enhance the terms and bring the current legal instruments into the action. Of course, the environment is something that we sometimes disregard, but it paves the way to the future generation. Which planet are we leaving them? How the current international armed conflicts are affecting, how the aggressors should be responsible and how much they would pay for influence in the environment, which sometimes hits the ground, for instance, in Ukraine, but affects Moldova or Poland or Romania. I think we are observing currently the most important challenges for us all, dear friends. And I hope this important resolution will pave the way for the governments across the globe to react accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Madame Gören-Beluc. Please, the floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Madam President, I'd like to thank very much indeed the two rapporteurs for the excellent and detailed reports. Following the adoption by the United Nations General Assembly and the United Nations Human Rights Council of resolutions recognizing the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, we would like to commend the measures taken at the Reykjavik summit with this in mind. Climate change is one of the most serious existential crises facing humanity, and this problem can only be overcome if long-term solutions are found. It's important to develop environmentally friendly, sustainable and global solutions which prevent excessive waste use. It is important now, I think, to mention the Zero Waste Project, which is an exemplary project implemented in Turkey, which is perhaps one of the most important contributions to humanity. The Zero Waste Project was launched by the Ministry of the Environment, Urban Planning and Climate Change in 2017 under the aegis of Mrs. Emine Erdogan, the wife of our President Erdogan. The project was selected as an exemplary promising project in the OECD's 2019 report. The Zero Waste resolution submitted by Turkey to the United Nations in the context of efforts to combat climate change was adopted by the General Assembly on the 15th of December 2022. And through this resolution, which was supported by 105 countries, the 30th of March of every year continues to be celebrated throughout the world as the International Zero Waste Day. Zero waste is an objective that's defined as an approach to eliminate waste, which includes preventing waste, more efficient use of resources, reducing the quantity of generated waste, implementing a system of efficient waste collection and waste recycling. Since 2017, roughly 30 million tons of paper, 3 million tons of glass, 8 million tons of plastic, 4 million tons of metal, and 16 million tons of organic waste have been recycled and returned to the ecosystem. Through this recycling, roughly 2.5 billion kilowatts of electricity, 819 million cubic meters of water, and 127 million barrels of oil have been saved. Approximately 500 million trees have been saved, and 6 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions have been avoided. Dear parliamentarians, to control our waste in the context of sustainable development principles and to ensure that our common house, that is the world, remains clean and livable for future generations, the principle of zero waste should be adopted and waste management should be subject to an integrated approach. It's vital for the sustainable management of the climate crisis that environmentally friendly practices are developed, such as zero waste, throughout the world, and that they're an integral part of our lives. Once again, on behalf of my country, I'd like to thank very much indeed all the young people that are working to save the environment. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you, dear colleague. I now give the floor to Mr. Sanchez Garcia.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. Fortunately, I'm not in Brussels now. So, as a result, I don't think we can expect the police to burst in, having been sent by a local mayor trying to stop me exercise my freedom of expression. So, I'm delighted to be here in this assembly so that I can speak freely and with immunity which goes with my job. The creation of fundamental rights brings with it a series of problems, and one of them includes the very foundation of these rights. This is a serious challenge. Fundamental rights aren't created. In other words, these rights exist before legislators start thinking about them. This is why the whole idea of creating a fundamental right goes against the philosophy which underpin those rights. We're talking about creating a right to a healthy environment, and we're talking about this in the context of climate change. In the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights handed down in April, which has been mentioned beforehand, that's based on the same principles as the Roe versus Wade from back in 1969, when the Supreme Court of the United States ruled on abortion. Since there was no right on abortion, the court said that in reality, abortion could be viewed as a manifestation of the right to intimity. And this is exactly what the court is now doing when it comes to the right to a healthy environment, referring to this supposed right as coming under Article 8 of the Convention. That's the right to a private and family life. Okay, in this case, it's perhaps less serious. At least in this case, although it's an invention which has no legal basis, at least it has the quality, I won't say the virtue, but the quality of not being in violent contradiction of a pre-existing right, which is the right to life, which certainly applies in the question of abortion. This isn't just my position, nor is it either theoretical or a practical position of my group. I'm simply quoting the Federal Supreme Court in a decision adopted June 2023 in the Dobbs versus Jackson Health Organization ruling. That ruling confirmed that in the Roe versus Wade ruling there was a mistake. In US law, there is no such thing as a fundamental right to abortion. So we, as Europeans, I think would be well advised to take a look at what's happening across the Atlantic, and that perhaps would make us think twice about coming forward with such ridiculous ideas.
The next speaker is Mr. Schanach. You have the floor, 3 minutes.
Danke sehr, Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you, Madam President. Unlike the previous speaker, for whom there is clearly no climate emergency or crisis, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to both rapporteurs. In particular, I do this as a representative of a country which, embarrassingly enough, doesn't have a climate protection law, despite the fact that we're surrounded by melting glaciers and increasingly severe weather events. I would like to welcome the resolution on world seas and oceans because there's an urgent need to adopt a moratorium on deep-sea mining and this frenetic extraction of nodules from the sea, which is highly destructive. 10 years ago, we were able to ascertain that the extraction was going on in a zone between Algeria and Italy. The situation hasn't improved with time. The Mediterranean isn't an ocean, but it's one of the most frequently used or most important areas for navigation in the world. And thanks to French researchers, we know that more than 60% of the Mediterranean is now polluted with plastic. In other words, the sea bottom is covered with plastic, which means that marine organisms are eating plastic. This has important implication. Another important matter linked to climate protection and the protection of the oceans is biodiversity. Recently, I was able to have a look at James Cook's diary, Captain Cook, and it was very moving to see that 9 out of 10 of the animals depicted in his diary are now extinct. We're talking here about species which, once they've gone, won't be coming back again. And that underlines just how dramatic the loss of biodiversity is. It's also important to recognize that island states who are practically underwater even now are having to face the possibility of evacuating the island states, and that demonstrates once again the urgency of the situation. And as an Austrian, all I can do is express my thanks to our friends from Switzerland who've been instrumental in bringing about this judgment from the court. Hopefully, this judgment will initiate a positive change for all of our lives. So once again, I'd like to thank those courageous Swiss citizens for having initiated this process, not just the seniors, or not just for the seniors, but they've done this for upcoming generations. Thank you very much, and we will be fully supportive.
Mr. Shanach. The next speaker is Mrs. Kravchuk. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear Simone, dear Julia, thank you for your tremendous work on these reports. And indeed, the urgency of environmental degradation has never been clearer. And the right to live in a healthy and safe environment is the fundamental human right. And I think it's very symbolical that today we discuss these two resolutions in this chamber with all these young people on the balconies, and be sure they will be fighting for this right. And I'm sure that they are watching you, and they are waiting not for the words, but for actions when you come back to your countries. I would like to bring more attention to how the full-scale invasion of Russia to Ukraine had been not just making the life of Ukrainians unbearable, but how it influences the environment in other countries. And it doesn't just kill people, destroys infrastructure, but also causes the most extensive environmental damage in decades. During the full-scale invasion of Russia, Ukraine's environment has suffered damage worth more than 51 billion euro. 812 protected sites have been damaged, and 514 sites of the Nature Reserve Fund remain occupied. Russia's destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power station last year led to a large-scale environment disaster and has all the features of a war crime and ecocide. In total, 600 species of animals and 750 species of plants, including endangered, have been damaged as a result of Russian aggression. It is often forgotten, but military operations in the Black and Azov Seas have a direct direct impact on the seas and the countries that are on these seas. And thank you, Julia, for addressing this issue. I cannot agree more that it is important for the Assembly to invite member states to consider an environmental compact for Ukraine, a green future, recommendations for accountability and recovery proposed by the high-level working group on the environmental consequences of the war concerning the environmental damage affecting the Black Sea. And the last but not the least, I'd like to talk about the demining and how Ukrainian territory is mined. This is more than 172,000 square kilometers, just like 5 territories of Belgium. Restoration of our ecosystem and normal life in Ukraine is possible only after the demining, and we would like to call to member states to help us with this process. And also, I would like to urge you to support both resolutions and did really go to our states, to our home, and do more for securing these fundamental rights for health and environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Kravchuk. The next speaker is Mrs. Arslan. The floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'd like first of all to express my warmest thanks to our rapporteurs for these very important reports. And it's widely known that the climate crisis is moving inexorably forward and that its effects are being ever more tangibly felt. The most recent events we've seen with enormous heat waves and other extreme weather phenomena do not leave it possible to have any further doubt that we need urgently to deal with this situation, especially for vulnerable groups like older people, children, and also for farming, where we see particularly strong impact. I would like to speak on behalf of my country, Switzerland. And we, unfortunately, do not presently respect the criteria laid down in the Paris Agreement, which is attempting to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. On the contrary, for instance, the European Union, with their Green Deal investment program and the legal packet Fit for 55, have taken ambitious measures to protect us from the effects of climate change. And we have a very strong responsibility as a prosperous and economically strong country to protect our climate and our biodiversity. Unfortunately, these measures have not yet been taken to a sufficient extent. The recent ruling of the European Court of Justice for Human Rights, which gave what we call the claim senior and elderly women who are impacted by the climate, this ruling was in their favor, and this shows this. And here I would like to thank that sector of the population for their engagement on behalf of us all. Here I would ask you, for instance, you, Mr. Kleinvector, to notice that perhaps we have to stick to facts, particularly in this context, and to respect the rulings of our institutions such as the court, and perhaps have a look at that more closely. As people who make decisions, we all have a responsibility to preserve our planet for future generations as well as a place where it is possible to live. To have an effective climate policy applied, it is urgent and necessary that the right for a healthy environment be clearly and unambiguously formulated by the Council of Europe. A legally binding framework is necessary, and we also need to have legal protection of the idea of the right to a healthy environment as a human right, and to deal with this in a coherent way. I would also like to talk about the oceans and what we've talked about in terms of plastic pollution in the oceans, which have consequences for us. And let us work together so as to take necessary measures so as to protect our environment and to leave a durable future for the generations to come. Many thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Arslan. I now give the floor to the next speaker, Mrs. Komenko. Please, Olena, the floor is yours for 3 minutes.
honorable members, today we stand at a pivotal moment not only for Europe but for the world at large. It is with a sense of urgency and a heavy heart I address the environmental crisis we face, crises that demand immediate, decisive action. Firstly, it is appalling that within our European continent, we lack a formal, autonomous right to a healthy environment. This right transcends individual liberties, safeguarding not just the present, but ensuring the sanctity of our world for future generations. The disparity within our legal frameworks across Europe, where this fundamental right remains unanchored, is a glaring oversight we must promptly address. Turning focus to my homeland, Ukraine, we witness an egregious assault on the environment, a testament to the ravages of war. The Russian Federation's actions have not only inflicted unspeakable human suffering, but have also perpetrated severe crimes against nature itself. In the face of such devastation, it becomes imperative to reference the significant guiding document, Environmental Compact for Ukraine, a Green Future, recommendations for accountability and recovery proposed by the high-level working group on the environmental consequences of the war. The establishment this document provides a blueprint for rectification and recovery, emphasizing the dire need for a comprehensive compensation mechanism. The establishment of such a mechanism, as previously discussed in this Assembly, must be our collective goal, dear colleagues. With regard to the environment, it is possible to say that it aims not only to address the immediate reparations required, but also to align with the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. By supporting this initiative, we commit to restoring nature, aiding countries in war-torn despair, and enhancing the capacity of Ukrainian authorities to manage and mitigate environmental damage. Moreover, the timeliness of criminalizing ecocide in Europe and all over the world, for instance, within the Rome Statute, cannot be overstated. As we witness the degradation of our natural world, the necessity for such legislation becomes even more crucial. This legal recognition will serve as a deterrent and the framework for accountability, ensuring that those responsible for environmental crimes face the consequences of their actions. In the context of the Black Sea, the urgency to preserve this pristine environment while prosecuting the crimes committed against it is paramount. The militarization of this region and the illegal construction activities, notably the Kerch Bridge, have wreaked havoc on biodiversity and ecosystems. This destruction, a clear manifestation of ecocide, demands our immediate attention and action. In closing, I call upon this Assembly and our partners to be bold in our endeavors. The creation of a compensation mechanism, the criminalization of ecocide, and the intensified efforts to safeguard the Black Sea are not just aspirations, but necessities. Let us be the architects of change, ensuring a resilient, restored, and protected environment for all. Together, we can forge a path towards accountability, recovery, and sustainability. Thank you, dear colleagues.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam. The next speaker is from Canada. Mr. Brian Francis, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Honorable colleagues, just under a month ago, we celebrated World Water Day. In less than a week, we'll celebrate Earth Day. Those anniversaries remind us of the need to celebrate our planet and its resources. But they also remind us that our planet is suffering. Thank you, Rapporteur, for highlighting the role this organization has to play in strengthening the special link between human rights and the environment, including the seas and the oceans. For the Mi'kmaq in the Atlantic region of Canada, water is life. As such, it must be protected. This desire to protect our resources has been passed on to us through an ancient connection. As Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, we have been the caretakers of the land and water since time immemorial. Today, paradoxically, indigenous peoples are among the most vulnerable groups to climate change. For the Lennox Island First Nation, situated in Nebeguit, where I grew up, the situation is critical. It loses more land every year due to rising sea levels. Consequently, this morning, I would like to briefly present two Mi'kmaq concepts, the concepts of Ndudulimp and that of two-eyed seeing, because they demonstrate how indigenous and non-indigenous peoples can celebrate to fight the climate crisis. Collaborate. First, the Ndudulimp reminds us of our independence with the natural world, that we are all connected, and that every relationship between people, animals, plants, and the environment is reciprocal. The Ndudulimp philosophy embraces cultural and spiritual connections with resource stewardship. It puts forward a state of mind according to which one is aware of one's environmental impact and the necessity that one should only consume the resources one needs. Second is two-eyed seeing. It is a concept championed by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall. He defines it as learning to see from one eye with the strength of indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strength of mainstream knowledges and the ways of knowing, and to use both these eyes together for the benefit of all. It is both a methodological framework and guiding principle, as it emphasizes the need to cohabit and take the time to learn from each other's reality in order to work together by taking the best of both Western and indigenous world views. It is by working together and intertwining our realities that solutions and successful strategies can be implemented to protect our environment. Walalan, thank you. Merci.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, sir. Let me now give the floor to Ms. Yasko from Ukraine.
Dear colleagues, you know, I'm often asked as Ukrainian, when was that first moment when we crossed the border since the beginning of the war to the areas where there were no war? And you know, surprisingly, I remember that moment a lot. Yes, there were queues of people, there were a lot of tears, but there was also one thing that I remember very clearly that really broke my heart, is the fact that the birds were singing on the border. For quite a long time, and it was our first trip actually to Strasbourg when we were crossing the border with our female members of the parliament. And I was so shocked that for all the days I didn't hear the nature. And unfortunately, that's happening in many parts of Ukraine where Russia is committing everyday crimes on the environment. It can be huge crimes or it can be post factum crimes, and every time when their air missile is flying to any of the towns, you know what happens in the animal shelters? Dogs have heart attacks. The same happens with cats, and every time, if you ever just look at this information and you speak to people who are doing this help for animal shelters, you will know how many animals are dying. And it's not only because of the crime at the Kakhovka Dam, where hundreds, thousands of animals and trees and flora and fauna is absolutely destroyed, and we will have that consequences for the generations to come, and not only in Ukraine, but also in other parts of the world. And unfortunately, every day we're getting threatened by new possible nuclear threats and Zaporizhia plant. And if we just imagine what would it be if another big crimes happen, it's going to be big global disasters. But there is one good news. When the war has started, many of you stopped being dependent on Russian energy. Many of you fully stopped or reduced your dependence, and it's very good not only for the civilized choice, but also for environment. please be creative. Do make that tools that will matter for the generations to come. And don't forget about that the birds actually should be singing in different parts of the world. And there should be no air missiles that stop you from hearing that sounds.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam. I give the floor to Mr. Lukaitis from Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues, I would like to thank our rapporteurs for their diligent work on this matter of utmost importance. The fact that this issue comes today before the Assembly, just a few weeks after the historic decision of the European Court on Human Rights, is indeed a very welcome development. The Court's decision against the State of Switzerland ruled that under human rights law, Member States are legally obliged to meet their climate-related targets and ensure the provision of a safe and healthy environment to their citizens. The right to a healthy environment is, for the first time, presented as it should, a fundamental human right of access to clean water, sanitation and food, to live in a safe and sustainable environment where resources are not depleted and people's health and livelihood is not threatened by the climate crisis. However, it will be a grave omission not to mention that securing the human right to a healthy environment should not be yet another exclusive privilege of European and Western citizens. Peoples from developing countries, migrants and refugees, as well as minorities, bear the consequences and the burden of climate change disproportionately, despite contributing minimally to its causes. Already vulnerable and exposed to multiple difficulties, these people, in fact, are faced with the imminent threat of becoming climate refugees. Dear colleagues, we must also add to this discussion that the need to regulate the fundamental human right to a clean and healthy environment comes at a time when Israel's aerial bombardment and ground invasion in Gaza is causing an unprecedented level of environmental catastrophe, an ecocide, alongside the humanitarian catastrophe. Even though environmental concerns are of secondary importance in the face of the ongoing genocide, the devastating climate effects of this war can no longer be ignored. Air, water, and debris pollution, malnourished and dehydrated children with no access to sanitation or health services constitute an internal part of the crimes committed right now by Israel, along with the destruction of almost entirely of the Palestinian territories and their human and non-human ecosystems. States, governments and politicians must take action against the imminent threat of climate degradation and be held accountable. The Reykjavik process presents a unique opportunity to this effect. As parliamentarians, we should catalyse meaningful change through innovative legislation. But let us not forget that environmental justice is intrinsically linked to social justice. We cannot achieve one without the other. In a landmark decision, the United Nations General Assembly recognized the right to a healthy environment in 2022, acknowledging the obligations of states to address the impacts of environmental degradation on humans by regulating and enforcing effective legislation for the protection of the environment and the human and non-human organisms that inhabit it. It is time that the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe considers this matter as a top priority and support Member States in drafting and implementing holistic, just and rigid legislative frameworks that will enshrine the right to climate justice as a fundamental human right for all. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. I now call Mr. Bertrand Bouix, who is replacing his French colleague. Thank you, Chair, Rapporteur, dear colleagues. I wish to take the floor on the draft resolution mainstreaming the human right to a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment of the Reykjavik process, and particularly on the towards Council of Europe strategies for healthy seas and oceans to counter the climate crisis as an MP for a coastal territory which is especially sensitive to this issue, and because I sincerely believe democracy issues and human rights issues, which are the driving force of our institution, are particularly entwined with environmental issues. Indeed, the report spells out that seas and oceans of our planet are complex and fragile ecosystems. Today, the oceans and seas provide 50% of the oxygen needed for life. They absorb a quarter of carbon dioxide emissions and capture 90% of the excess heat generated by such emissions. What will happen tomorrow when the seas and oceans are beating temperature records month on month if they can no longer do that job? Everything else and all the other issues which we discuss will then become meaningless. The Reykjavik summit highlighted the need for a right to a healthy environment. This right should be effective in each member state, but also at the level of the Council of Europe, which has a vocation to spawn a true human right to a healthy environment internationally on the model of other thematic conventions. Our work to establish the architecture of environmental rights could be facilitated by the historic agreement concluded on the 4th of March last year under the UN's aegis, leading on the 19th of June of last year to the adoption of the International Treaty for the Protection of the High Seas and Marine Biodiversity. This agreement overhauls regulation of international waters, the protection of which was previously fragmented and which were not included either in the inland waters or the territorial waters of a state pursuant to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Montego Bay Convention. The new treaty fundamentally changes governance within and outside territorial waters. The high seas are now deemed to be a global public good, covering a little more than half the world's surface, or some 64% of the oceans. It virtually recognizes a legal personality for the oceans, with rights, the prime one of which is to maintain a temperature which is survivable for biodiversity and ensures that the climate does not experience overly brutal upheaval. The treaty is to be signed and ratified by 60 states if it is to enter into force by 2025. The French government has tabled a bill authorizing its ratification. It is being considered by the Foreign Affairs Committee of our National Assembly, and I encourage all countries on our continent to sign and ratify it as soon as possible in accordance with their constitutional norms, pending which I will enthusiastically vote for the draft resolution. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Weeks. I now call Ms. Erotokrito from Cyprus.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, dear rapporteurs, I would like to congratulate and thank you for these excellent reports. We're facing a full-on climate emergency with devastating consequences on every aspect of our lives. The initiatives taken following up on the political commitments made in Reykjavik are valuable steps forward. Nonetheless, the Council of Europe should, without delay, officially recognize the protection of the right to a healthy environment as what it is, a collective and an individual human right. It should further proceed with strategic action plans, taking into account concrete recommendations brought forth by the Parliamentary Assembly, such as ensuring that the new notion of ecocide as a criminal offence and establishing an intergovernmental committee to assist with the implementation of relevant decisions taken. It should also stress that all, and not almost all, of its members recognise the right to a healthy environment through pertinent national legislation. Beyond that, it is of paramount importance that the Council of Europe urges its members to fully align with all major international treaties, conventions and multilateral agreements on protecting the environment, especially those that regulate human impact on our natural habitat, including the oceans and seas that bind us together. It is difficult to overestimate the importance of effectively protecting our oceans and seas in our efforts to counter the climate crisis. One cannot stress enough their social and economic importance, not only for coastal countries. Marine pollution, rising water temperatures, acidification, the collapse of fish stocks and biodiversity are common challenges that demand urgent action. In this respect, supporting global responses, such as the United Nations High Seas Treaty and the United Nations SDG 14, are significant enough, as are European-centered initiatives like turning climate neutral by 2050. At the same time, as long as countries that are major polluters don't show the same commitment towards international treaties such as the Paris Agreement or the Kyoto Protocol, we will not be able to reverse the destruction of our ecosystem and effectively address the adverse effects to human health and economic conditions, especially on vulnerable communities, which we must never forget. Dear colleagues, I come from an island country surrounded by the Mediterranean, an enclosed sea which connects Southern Europe with Northern Africa and the Middle East. It is highly contaminated by waste, especially microplastics, threatening not only the marine ecosystem, but also human health. We must accept that there is a general worldwide failure to take effective and timely action on climate change. Now we need to take big leaps very quickly. We must agree on the highest political level to commit to short-term, high-impact targets in order to even return to being optimistic about having a healthy and sustainable environment for our future generations. I would therefore wholeheartedly support both resolutions. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam. After Canada earlier, we now go back to the Americas, and I call on Ms. Giron Hernandez from Mexico. You have the floor, Madam.
Con su permiso, Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President, since the Rio Summit in 1992, the international community has begin to become aware of what lies ahead, and it's certainly not flattering. As a result, agreements were signed on biodiversity and climate change, as well as the adoption of the Earth Charter and Agenda 21, which today have led to Agenda 2030, the one that has been so much attacked by conspiracy theorists. We welcome these two reports on the environment with the aim that the Council of Europe should place the issue of the human right to a healthy environment within the appropriate legal framework in order to make its importance visible and effective within the framework of recognized rights. Precisely because there are different scopes, both globally and nationally, the recognition of a legal mandate applicable to all is essential in order to comply with the general principles of human rights, especially those of universality and progressiveness. In Mexico, the right to a healthy environment has been recognized in the legal framework since 1988, initially in secondary legislation, and then in 1997, this was elevated to constitutional status, along with the right to integral and sustainable development. This constitutional recognition has created not only a concurrent environmental legal framework in which the different levels of government have powers with respect to their jurisdictional scope, but also a federal law of environmental liability to prevent and punish damage caused to the environment, as well as to repair and compensate said damage when necessary through federal judicial procedures, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, administrative procedures, and those corresponding to the commission of crimes against the environment and environmental management. The precepts of this legal order have the idea to preserve and restore our environment and environmental balance so as to guarantee human rights to a healthy environment for the well-being of all persons and the responsibility that has been generated by such harm when it is done. We consider, however, that yet more remains to be done, and the countries that pollute the most are very slow to adopt the legal measures we're talking about. Global warming is here to stay for this generation and generations to come, and the question is to know how many degrees it will rise in the next decade and what will be the real impact of this rise in temperature on children and older adults. The widespread recognition of this right can help to limit the environmental ignorance that exists in our countries today. We must give our environment a chance before it is too late and regret it in a decade's time here in this hemicycle. So we would wish to support amendment number 8 presented by... Could you conclude, please, Madam? Many thanks.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam. I now call on Ms. Pelin Yülük from Turkey.
Vous avez la parole, Madame.
You have the floor, Madam. Ms. Yülük.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, securing the future of seas and oceans is a very important step in developing a strategy for countering climate change. The seas and oceans play a vital role in sustaining life on Earth. To the United Nations, oceans and seas provide 50% of the oxygen needed for life, absorb a quarter of all carbon dioxide emissions, and capture 90% of the excess heat from these emissions. Thus, it is vital to address the seas and oceans in the context of the climate crisis. Oceans and seas constitute one of the world's most important and complex ecosystems. However, these precious ecosystems have faced serious threats in recent years due to increased human activities and climate change. Scientific research and evidence show that the health of oceans and seas is deteriorating due to plastic pollution, water pollution, overfishing, and climate change. According to recent statistics, 8 million tons of plastics get into the oceans every year. For this reason, we have to take definitive safeguards measures to prevent pollution in oceans and seas. Despite the challenges, I would also like to commend the positive initiatives undertaken by the Council of Europe in addressing this issue. After last year's Reykjavik summit, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment gained further political recognition. This is a promising step forward. I believe that recent developments would provide ample opportunity for effective protection of the oceans and seas. Finally, there is an urgent need for collaboration among member states in order to establish international regulations for the protection of oceans and seas. Therefore, I call on all member states to take immediate action on this issue. It is urgent that the international community come together to take decisive action to protect the central role of the seas and oceans on Earth. If the necessary steps are not taken on this issue, the climate crisis will deepen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. I now call on Jeremy Corbyn of the United Kingdom.
This is obviously a crucial debate, and I welcome the reports that have been put before us, and I welcome the fact that we're having the debate at all. The idea that it should be rejected, as some of the Conservative groups seem to be saying, on the basis it's not applicable to our Constitution is both wrong, in my view, in what we're here for, but also, what answer is that to people around the world who are suffering from rising sea levels, terrible weather conditions and weather patterns, increasing levels of pollution and loss of biodiversity, if their political representatives are not even prepared to debate the issue on the basis of some obscure view that it might not be applicable to our powers? Surely to goodness we need to be saying to the governments of Europe, all those that are affiliated to this body, we need to put into law the right to clean air, clean water, and a clean, sustainable environment. We already voted last year on ecocide. Surely we can go a bit further today, and I absolutely welcome the basis on which these reports have been done. The rising sea levels, climate change, and loss of biodiversity are all brought about by our disregard for the natural world and nature and our allowance of greed to take over. Human beings cannot live without nature, but nature can live without human beings. We need to have a much more comprehensive and coherent view of how we adapt our economies and our lives in order to live on a sustainable planet and live in a sustainable environment. At the moment, it's the poorest people in the poorest countries And the poorest people in the poorest cities that breathe the worst air, eat the worst food, and drink the worst water. And it is farmers all over the world that suffer as a result of that. We've allowed greed to take over in so many areas. I'll give an example. The river qualities all over the United Kingdom are getting worse and worse. The levels of pollution of the seas around Britain are getting worse and worse. And there's a direct thread between this and the privatisation of our water services in 1989 and 1990. Massive profits have been taken out of the water industry, and as a result, we have worse water quality and worse sea quality as a result of it. In the last 6 months alone, Thames Water, the largest of the water companies, took out £166 million in profit. They've spent 30 years paying massive dividends and running up debt to pay dividends, whilst at the same time wasting water, polluting our rivers and damaging the seas all around Britain. And of course, pollution knows no boundaries. Pollution from one country leads to another. Let's support this report. Let's support the principles behind it. But above all, say that decent environment, decent quality of life is a human right.
Merci.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Ms. Edith Estrela from Portugal.
Thank you, Chairman. I start by thanking Simon and Julia for their excellent, timely and inspiring reports that contribute to the implementation of the Reykjavik process through concrete and realistic proposals. The report highlights the urgent need to formalize the right to a healthy environment within the Council of Europe. The right to a healthy environment should be recognized in law as an autonomous human right in each member state. At the Council of Europe level, this right can be achieved through an additional protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights or an autonomous convention. Due to its history and its objectives, our Assembly must be an example for the world in defending fundamental rights. We must be ambitious. In my report on climate crisis and the rule of law, approved by this Assembly in 2021, I proposed to create a network of contact parliamentarians for a healthy environment that represents an important step towards involving parliamentarians in defending a healthy environment. We were ambitious, and we are now working together for a healthy environment. The report stresses the importance of capitalizing on existing Council of Europe standards and developing strategic environmental governance, including a special intergovernmental committee and a monitoring mechanism. It calls for concrete and concerted action to prevent the Council of Europe from losing its credibility in environmental action. Dear colleagues, do you know that it has been more than 15 years since Al Gore, former Vice President of the United States and Nobel Peace Prize winner, alerted the world to an inconvenient truth and warned us that climate change threatens future generations? The most inconvenient truth is that we are doing too little and too slowly. And if we continue down this path, we could finish not with the planet, but with life on Earth. Experts claim that the climate crisis threatens all the progress made after the Second World War. The Reykjavik Declaration is clear. It highlights the urgency of additional efforts to protect the environment, as well as to combat the impact of pollution, climate change, and biodiversity loss on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Human rights are at stake. The first of these is the right to survival. the right of young people to a future. This is up to me, this is up to you, this is up to us. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam. The last speaker in this debate will be Mr. Milos Konata from Montenegro.
Distinguished Chair, dear colleagues, also dear visitors, first of all, I would like to thank rapporteurs for their tremendous work and devotion to the topics that we are addressing today. In my opinion, we are having in front of us two pressing issues that are intertwined in their urgency and significance. I want to use this opportunity to strongly support formalization and recognition the right to healthy environment as a human right within Council of Europe. The challenge of climate change is our reality and the greatest existential emergency for humankind. Our response must be urgent, bold, and common in achieving additional efforts to protect the environment. We, as a Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, must look to the future and set direction and standards in protecting the environment, which will be held accountable for decades to come. As noted at summit in Reykjavik, triple planetary crisis of pollution, climate change, and loss of biodiversity affect human rights, democracy, and rule of law on a global scene. Furthermore, it has profound implications for the rights of future generations, as it jeopardizes the ability of current generations to meet their needs without compromising the ability of future ones to do the same. As a representative from Montenegro that adopted the Declaration on the Ecological State 33 years ago and put ecology as a priority in its constitution, I strongly support all initiatives that will protect and promote human right to a healthy environment. The Council of Europe is an organization recognized for its values and focused on respecting and protecting the human rights of every individual. I also believe that the Reykjavik process stands as a cornerstone and guideline to a progress in our collective pursuit for environmental justice. We all have the additional responsibility to recognize the fundamental right of every individual to live in a clean and healthy environment and to integrate environmental considerations into all aspects of policy making, ensuring that environmental protection becomes not just a goal, but a guiding principle in governance. To conclude, mainstreaming the human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is not only a moral imperative, but also a practical necessity in our fight against the climate crisis. We have an opportunity not only to mitigate the impact of climate change, but also to safeguard the well-being of future generations. Let us seize the opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to environmental justice and take bold and decisive action to create a sustainable and equitable world for all. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. So we now have to interrupt the list of speakers. Those present during the debate but not able to take the floor may give their typed text to the table office for publication in the official report by 4 p.m. And they must be submitted electronically if possible. We shall now take the replies, and I begin with Ms. Ovchinikova. You have the floor for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, first of all, I'd like to sincerely thank you for this emotional debate and your contributions, comments and real care for maritime heritage and environmental safety for us and for our future generation. I'm very happy that really a lot of young people here. I'm sure that our future is really our young generation. So thank you for addressing major problem, areas linked in the marine and warming ocean temperature, this fishing industry, exploitation of mineral resources in the seabed in particular, the deep sea mining. Yes, as you know that in our report we include the situation in Norway because we have signed with the European Parliament, with parliamentarians of all countries, and pay attention on these issues. It's really very important. So, and protection of coastal population, biodiversity, plastic waste, and chemical problems as well. And really, I'm deeply touched as well that today we had the voices from all the globe, not only from European countries, but from Canada, from Mexico. It's really very, very, very important that indeed water is life for all of us, and it's not a metaphor. So the global solidarity and urgent joint action are highly needed today. If we want to pass our planet in lively condition, we necessarily do all the best for this. Thank you for your contribution, for your professional comments. I hope we are together do all the best in order to protect environmental and to recognize ecocide and to work together with to protect rights to a health and safe environment. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam. It's now Simon Moukkin's turn. You have 3 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I have many things to say. First of all, thank you all for your statements, and I'd like to thank some specific speakers, particularly our Ukrainian colleagues, and demonstrate our solidarity with each and every one of you with regard to this crime of ecocide taking place. It's not just biodiversity which is affected by ecocide, it also affects future generations in terms of cancer. Bombing can cause cancer and malformation, so I really think it's also important to take that war into account, but also 98% of the water table in Gaza is polluted. We'll be discussing that this afternoon. So wars have an impact on the environment. We need to remember it. I'd like to greet our colleagues from Canada and Mexico who said that climate disruption knows no borders. 2 or 3 years ago in Canada, there was a village which basically melted at 52 degrees heat. And I'd like to commend our colleagues from Turkey. 2 of them spoke. It's the rather sad anniversary soon of an earthquake which killed tens of thousands of people in Turkey. And that reminds us of the importance of the right to a healthy environment. It also means a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment, and safe is important in the context of the environment. We must protect the safety of our citizens with respect to the consequences of climate change. Now, unfortunately, we've heard that climate skepticism is not becoming extinct, unlike 59% of the planet's biodiversity. It's completely divorced from the youth in the hall today. It's alive and kicking. Some of you are denouncing the court by saying it's a government of judges. Dear colleagues, that is exactly the purpose of our work. Our work today as lawmakers is to determine a framework for a healthy environment. So the judges have a definition decided upon by the lawmaker. It's the complete reverse of what you are arguing in criticizing the judges. We're talking about lawmaking on behalf of the people, and it's a shame to hear this. And people have said we don't need new rights to a healthy environment, and I'm pleased that after the Second World War, some people had the courage to create the European Court of Human Rights and recognize the rights in the Convention. And we need to recognize the rights of future generations. And I would suggest that you look at the young people in their eyes and tell them your future is not important. Your right to a clean environment is not valid. Just try telling them that. And then look at the number of people dying from cancer now. Look at the farmers who can no longer plough the soil because of the aridity of the soil. So if you're climate skeptics, just talk to those people and try to convince them that they shouldn't have a healthy environment. It's a crucial phase now. The credibility of our assembly is at stake. We must recognize this, and the committee of ministers must recognize this right to a healthy environment. And I'll conclude quickly by saying that what we do today is to determine the degree of happiness or suffering of future generations. That's what we're doing. If we stand idly by, silent on this issue, then we'll be imposing terrible suffering on future generations. And I think that is our role as politicians, to guarantee a future for coming generations, to guarantee a fair and green future for future generations. And I'd like to thank the Secretary General and the colleagues who've been working on these issues with me, especially Claire Dubois, who for her first report has done a sterling job. Thank you to her, and thank you to each and everyone.
Merci, Monsieur Moutquin.
Thank you, Mr. Moutquin. I'd now like to give the floor to Mr. Armin Gevorgyan, who is the Vice Chair of the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development. You have 3 minutes.
Dear colleagues, this Assembly has consistently pleaded for the strengthening of the Council of Europe action to effectively protect the human rights to a healthy environment. In Reykjavik last year, head of states and governments endorsed the political commitment to defend this right and to make it a visible priority for the Council of Europe work. The two reports we have just debated call for action. We must move from words to deeds so that the right to a healthy environment takes shape and becomes reality through legal instruments and action plans at both European and national levels. I should recall that the United Nations have recognized this right as a human right first in 2021 through a resolution of the Human Rights Council, and then in 2022 through a resolution of the UN General Assembly, with Council of Europe member states voting in favor. The European Court of Human Rights and the European Committee of Social Rights have developed case law to protect the environment and the right to a healthy environment indirectly. However, as we have seen last week from the free landmark judgment delivered by the court in climate cases, there are systemic limitations that need to be overcome. The right to a healthy environment needs to be translated into actionable legal tools and mechanisms of the Council of Europe. As it is an autonomous right for the international community, it has to be considered as such also at the European level. We are part of the international community, and we have to be more ambitious and coherent in our engagement to protect all human rights. I wish to thank our reporters for the tremendous work they have done, and all those who have participated in this debate, as well as the members of our wonderful Secretariat. I trust that we can endorse the text put forward for adoption and send a strong signal to our member states. Mr. Chairman, I would like to inform you that the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development rejected the 9 amendments tabled to the draft resolution on mainstreaming the human rights to a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment with the Reykjavik process. Thank you for your attention.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Vice Chair. So the debate is now closed, and we come to consideration of the first report, mainstreaming the human right to a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment with the Reykjavik process. That is document 15,955. The Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development has presented a draft resolution to which 9 amendments have been tabled, and a draft recommendation to which no amendments have been tabled. Again, document 15,955. So we shall now take up the draft resolution, and you've just been told by the Vice Chair of the committee that all the amendments were rejected in the committee by a 2/3 majority of those who voted. Is that indeed the case, Mr. Gevorgyan?
That's the case.
Merci.
Thank you. If no one objects, I shall consider the amendments to be rejected once and for all. If there's an objection, we will need to verify it has the required support of 10 people. Is there any such objection?
Soit il n'y a pas d'objection.
So there is no objection. So all the amendments are therefore rejected and will not be tabled.
Nous allons donc maintenant...
So let us now vote on the draft resolution. A simple majority is required. So we shall proceed to the vote on the draft resolution in document 15955, unamended, entitled Mainstreaming the Human Right to a Safe, Clean, Healthy and Sustainable Environment with the Reykjavik Process. So I'd remind you that a simple majority is required and the vote is open.
Le scrutin est clos.
The vote is closed and I call for the result to be displayed.
Le projet de résolution dans le document 15...
The draft resolution in document 15956 is adopted. Congratulations. Let us now go on to examine 15955. Since no amendment has been proposed, we will go on immediately to vote on that document. I remind you that a two-thirds majority is required. The vote is open.
Le scrutin est clos. Je demande...
The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. The draft recommendation in document 15955 is adopted by a two-thirds majority. Congratulations.
Nous en venons maintenant au...
This brings us to the second report called Towards Consular Strategies for Healthy Seas and Oceans to Counter the Climate Crisis, document 15956. The committee has presented a draft resolution and a draft recommendation to which no amendments have been proposed. Since that is the case, we will proceed directly to a vote on the draft resolution and then the draft recommendation. The vote on the draft resolution contained in document 15956. I remind you that a simple majority is required. The vote is open.
Le scrutin est clos.
The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. Draft resolution contained in document 15956 is adopted.
Nous allons procéder maintenant au...
Let us now go on to our vote on the draft recommendation contained in document 15956. I would remind you that a two-thirds majority is required. The vote is now open.
Le scrutin est clos.
The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. The recommendation contained in document 15956 is adopted, as it has received a two-thirds majority. Congratulations.
Voilà, nous sommes à la fin de nos débats.
This brings us to the end of our debate. The next sitting will happen this afternoon at 3:30 with the agenda that was approved in this part session. The sitting is closed. Have a good lunch.